Sodom and Gomorrah by Marcel Proust, Volume 4 of In Search of Lost Time. So, I had to take a little extended hiatus after reading the last volume of In Search of Lost Time, The Garamond Way, because that was one of the most tedious things I have ever read in my life. Gorgeously written, very lush and beautiful, but it bored me out of my freaking skull, so I had to take a little sabbatical from Proust after reading that one. But I told myself, if you're going to get through all these books this year like you wanted to, you got to get back to them at some point. So I picked up the next one, and I've read Volume 4, Sodom and Gomorrah. And this one was better than the last one, I think. It was something of a rebound from the Garamond Way, but it's still not my favorite of the lot so far. I think that would be the second one. Within a Budding Grove was truly sublime, and things actually happened in that. People were met, places were traveled to. It had some kind of action in it. The third one did not. The third one, that one slowed my roll. But this one, like I said, was better, although still not the best, I don't think. But I will say this: Sodom and Gomorrah is the final volume of In Search of Lost Time, which was published during Proust's lifetime. The rest of the work was posthumously published. That's right. In Search of Lost Time, although it is regarded as the definitive modern novel, it is technically, I think, an unfinished work. Not that it doesn't have an ending. It's not like The Mystery of Edwin Drood or The Castle. It doesn't just cut off mid-sentence. But it wasn't really edited and revised, I don't think, as much as Proust probably would have wanted it to be. So I think you could categorize In Search of Lost Time as an unfinished work. But anyway, yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah was the last one that Proust got out while he was alive. So I'm curious to see how the later volumes will differ, if they do, from the preceding ones, if there is some kind of noticeable difference there. But anyway, so what is Sodom and Gomorrah about? Where do we pick up with our still nameless narrator in his aimless, meandering, affluent life? So, at the end of the Garamond Way, the narrator said that he saw something while he was waiting on going to this party, one of the freaking interminably long dinner parties, and there's a lot more of that in here. But while he was waiting, he saw something that he said that he would tell us about later. And he does that in the opening of Sodom and Gomorrah. He relates to us what he saw. And what he saw was the Baron de Charlus, who is the uncle to his best friend, Robert de Saint-Loup. He saw Baron de Charlus meet up with the tailor Jupin, and they got down. They knocked boots, and which kind of surprises the narrator because he did not know that Charlus or Jupin were gay prior to that. And as the title of the book probably alludes to, homosexuality is the predominant theme, motif in this work. There is a lot of time dedicated to musings on homosexuals, or as they're referred to in this book, in this era, as inverts. In fact, the entire first part of the book, part one of Sodom and Gomorrah, is literally like a 40-something page long essay about homosexuals throughout history and their role in society and such. And this is highly interesting because Proust himself, as we know, was gay. Maybe not openly so, but he definitely was gay. So it's kind of interesting to see him approaching this topic through the eyes of a protagonist who is straight. And it's kind of interesting to see his thoughts on the subject. which was, of course, quite personal to him. It makes for interesting reading, and I guess that's partly why I like this one better than the last one, because at least it was kind of wrestling with something, at least. But anyway, so yeah, the narrator sees Charlot and Jupin get down, and now we realize that Charlot is gay. And also, Charlot plays a much more prominent role in this book than he did in the preceding books, but I'll talk about that. So, the rest of the plot of this book can be summarized very, very briefly. And that's the funny thing, is that even though these books are freaking massive, the plots of them, uh, actually, I'll say the stories that they tell, because they don't even have what you would call a plot, but the stories that they tell can be summarized quite quickly because almost nothing happens. The narrator goes back to Baalbek, which is the seaside resort in which he stayed in the second volume, Within a Budding Grove. He goes there this time with his mother, and also his girlfriend Albertine, who is now, I guess, just his girl. He goes there, and then he goes to a lot of dinner parties, so many dinner parties, at the Verdurins, who were the people who had the salon in which Swan and Odette hit it off in the first book in the series, Swan's Way. And Charlot is there, and also Charlot is pursuing romantically this guy, this young man named Marcel, who sounds like just a freaking awful person, the way the narrator makes him out. Um, and there's lots of chit chat, lots of idle, inane conversation about nothing. And there is a whole heaping dose of jealousy on the part of the narrator, because, as it turns out, Charlot may not be the only one with homosexual proclivities. It turns out that Albertine may have an affinity for women because Dr. Cotard sees her and one of her girlfriends dancing with their bosoms pressed quite closely, tightly to each other. And so he tells the narrator, he's like, yeah, she might like women on the side in addition to liking you. You might want to watch out for that. So that just sets the narrator off, and he is like a hawk. He is like, I have to know if she's bisexual or if she's a lesbian. I have to know. He's like, there's no way in hell I'm letting her get down with girls when she's supposed to be my girl. Which, I was just like, dude, what the hell are you doing? Like, if she's into you and into girls as well, I'm like, hell, you could have some fun with that, I would think. But, the narrator is just overcome with jealousy. And so he's just watching her like a hawk. And also, he just treats Albertine like crap in this book. He says at the beginning, and he repeats throughout the whole thing, he's like, I didn't even love her. I was just, she was just my squeeze at the time. I really wasn't even into her. But, like, you wouldn't guess that based on the way he obsesses over her. But yeah, he just treats her like crap. He just strings her along and kind of manipulates her. Um, but they go to lots of dinner parties, and by the end of the book, the narrator decides, it ends on kind of a cliffhanger. The narrator resolves to marry Albertine to save her from her potential lesbianism, I guess. That's the book. That is all that happens in this. It's just dinner parties, romantic jealousy, and paranoia. Um, Musings on homosexuality, and that's pretty much it. Yeah, not much happens. However, it's still more entertaining than the last book, in which literally nothing happened. Um, so yeah, um, to talk about the technical aspects of this, I mean, start out with the writing. It's freaking gorgeous. It's Proust. I've just kind of resigned myself to the fact now that the writing in these books is, nigh untouchable. Like, Proust could craft a sentence like few, if any, other authors could. It is stunning to read. And that's really what keeps you going through all this just mundane, boring ass crap that's in these books, is because it is presented so beautifully. The writing's good. It's a knockout in terms of the writing. Now the characters, um, so the narrator, we begin to see more facets of the narrator's personality in this. Um, and we don't really necessarily like what we see, or at least I didn't, because the narrator is descending very quickly into complete douchebaggery. Like, he is kind of a twerp in this book. We saw him go in there in the last book when he became so obsessed with status and societal position and trying to gain admittance into these salons and just ass kissing his way to the top. But now that he's manipulating Albertine, even though he says he doesn't really care about her, um, he's really becoming more and more unlikable. In fact, by the end of this, I kind of didn't really like him all that much. And I've heard that it gets even worse in the next books, but didn't really like the narrator. But we're seeing more facets of his personality, like I said, just how petty he can be, how insecure he is. I mean, that kind of ties back in. He even kind of mentions it himself. It ties back into kind of the reaction that he had in the first book, and like the opening of the first book, where he was afraid that his mommy wouldn't come kiss him goodnight, and so he just threw like a wall-eyed fit, tears flowing and everything. He's kind of has issues. I think the narrator of these books has some issues. But the second major character in this, the one that plays a much bigger role than they did in the previous books, is the Baron de Charlus. Now, in the previous books, we first met Charlus in Within a Budding Grove at Baalbek in that book, and he was a kind of haughty and imperious figure that had a real kind of mystique to him. And then he played a bigger role in the third book when he offered to kind of like mentor the narrator, but then the narrator missed an appointment, so then they just had like a serious tiff towards the end of that book. But now Charlot is center stage in this book because a lot of the book is concerned with his romantic pursuit of this young violinist named Marcel, and how he's kind of trying to obscure his own gayness, but everybody, it's kind of like an open secret at this point, kind of. But we see a lot more of Charlot, and we also see more facets of his personality. And the mystique is pretty much gone by the end of this book. He's not as imposing of a figure as he was in the previous books. In fact, he's kind of pathetic. In the previous books, you really got the sense of this, like, again, like an imperious kind of aloof figure that has like a real, again, mystique to him. But in this one, he's just kind of this schlubby middle-aged man who's just desperately pursuing this violinist named Morel that kind of just uses him like the narrator uses Albertine, kind of, and kind of just strings him along, and also kind of makes fun of him behind his back. It's kind of sad, actually, and you kind of feel a little sympathy for the dude in this. But like I said, the mystique is just kind of gone after that. So the characters, it kind of shifts the focus in some ways. Um, but the characters are still good. They're still well rendered as far as they can be in a first person book. So yeah, no real complaints there. Now, as to the story, once again, that's what slowed my roll with the Guermont Way, because that book moved like molasses. This book is better a little bit. Like I said, it's kind of a rebound, but it still isn't like the second volume, which so far I think is the best. But it was good enough to where I wasn't just like slamming my head against the wall by the end of it. It moved enough, and there was enough that happened that I was engaged beyond just with the prose of it. Better than the last one, but it moves like hot molasses, I guess, rather than just room temperature molasses. Perhaps it's a little bit more going on plot wise, story wise, I guess, than the last one. So to rate Sodom and Gomorrah, I'm going to give Sodom and Gomorrah, much like the Garamond Way, an A minus. I think all of these books so far I've rated in the A range because even though they're not necessarily the most captivating things, they're not just keeping you hanging on the edge of your seat, just like turning pages compulsively. Despite that, the consummate skill that is on display here, the craftsmanship, the obvious mastery of language is such that it's, again, pretty much untouchable. So, again, even though these books, this one and the last one especially, didn't like hook me, I still, being objective, I'm still going to give them an A minus. I'm going to give Sodom and Gomorrah an A minus. So I think they've all stayed in the A range so far. But now that I have gone through the review of it, I thought, in keeping with my previous reviews of the In Search of Lost Time books, I would read a few excerpts because it's Proust. These lines demand to be read in some cases, and what really keeps me invested in these books is the little musings and observations which the narrator makes through the course of the story, and which are, again, very strikingly and just mouth-wateringly rendered. So if you don't mind if I consult my uh, cellular here to look at the page number to read these excerpts. Here on page 211. What happens to the narrator when he gets to Baalbek is that he has a little instance, where he bends over to untie his shoe, and he has kind of a flashback, another Proustian moment, to when his grandmother had done the same for him the last time they were at Baalbek. And his grandmother died in the previous book. That was like the only real thing that actually happened in the Garamond Way, was that his grandmother died. But we didn't see much grief from him in that book. He didn't really seem to uh, be hit all that hard by it. But he is here in this little Proustian moment that he has when he recalls when he and his grandmother last stayed at this hotel in Baalbek. The grief that he didn't feel, I guess, previously, all comes like flooding in on him now, and he is just kind of overwhelmed with sorrow because his grandmother has died. But it reads here in one of the more kind of poetic lines in the book. It says, "For with the perturbations of memory are linked the intermittencies of the heart. It is, no doubt, the existence of our body, which we may compare to a vase enclosing our spiritual nature, that induces us to suppose that all our inner wealth, our past joys, all our sorrows are perpetually in our possession." Uh, Good stuff. A lot of musings on memory and stuff in this, as it should be, because that memory is the main theme of In Search of Lost Time. But I like this scene here, wherever the narrator is finally just hit by the fact of his grandmother's loss. But now, beyond that, we have over here on page, I think it's 349, we have this passage right here. "We passionately long for there to be another life in which we shall be similar to what we are here below. But we do not pause to reflect that, even without waiting for that other life, in this life, after a few years, we are unfaithful to what we once were, to what we wish to remain immortally. People change, and that's kind of another like running theme in Search of Lost Time, is how people change, how time changes people." And that passage really kind of reflects that, I think. And again, poetic stuff, fun to read. And then over here on page 452, we have another excerpt. In this scene, there's a character. They're at one of the dinner parties, because the dinner parties occupy such a large bulk of this book. They're at the dinner party, and one of the characters is kind of being the butt of the jokes. There's kind of being made fun of and called out, which is, really mean and kind of incorrigible. But the narrator remarks that for the instinct of imitation and absence of courage governs society and the mob alike, and we all of us laugh at a person whom we see being made fun of, though it does not prevent us from venerating him 10 years later in a circle where he is admired. It is in the same fashion that the populace banishes or acclaims its kings. I think that's true. People are fickle, and yet again, that's another thing that we see so much of in Search of Lost Time is just how fickle and petty and shallow people actually are, and how it's kind of like, blood in the water with sharks when this poor character getting made fun of, how the others kind of just jump on board because, they're just that kind of petty, shallow people. And then over here on page 517, I think it is. Let's see. Yes. Okay, so the narrator here is musing once again on sleep. He did some musing on that I think, in the last volume as well. But this was just so beautifully rendered that I thought it demanded to be read. So the narrator says, the horses of sleep, like those of the sun, move at so steady a pace in an atmosphere in which there is no longer any resistance that it requires some little meteorite extraneous to ourselves, hurled from the azure by what unknown, to strike our regular sleep, which otherwise would have no reason to stop and would continue with a similar motion world without end, and to make it swing sharply round, return towards reality, travel without pause, traverse the regions bordering on life, whose sounds the sleeper will presently hear, still vague, but already perceptible, even if distorted, and come to earth suddenly at the point of awakening. Then from those profound slumbers we awaken at dawn, not knowing who we are, being nobody, newly born, ready for anything, the brain emptied of that past which was life until then. And perhaps it is more wonderful still when our landing at the waking point is abrupt and the thoughts of sleep, hidden by a cloak of oblivion, have no time to return to us gradually before sleep ceases. Then from the black storm through which we seem to have passed, but we do not even say we emerge prostrate, without a thought, a we that is void of content. What hammer blow has the person or thing that is lying there received to make it unconscious of everything, stupefied until the moment when memory, flooding back, restores to it consciousness or personality? However, for both these kinds of awakening, we must avoid falling asleep, even into a deep sleep, under the law of habit. For everything that habit ensnares in her nets, she watches closely. We must escape her, take our sleep at a moment when we thought we were doing something quite other than sleeping. Take, in a word, a sleep that does not dwell under the tutelage of foresight, in the company, albeit latent, of reflection. Good stuff. You wake up sometimes and you're like, where am I? When am I? Who am I? But your memories are what makes you in large part, right? I mean, again, the main theme of In Search of Lost Time is memory and how it is us, basically. I mean, everything that happens to a person exists after it happens, perceptibly at least, only in your own recollection of it. And I like that little passage there when the narrator is reflecting on the way that our past floods in upon us after that brief instant of unawareness, perhaps. And then over here, we're not done yet. Over here, we on page, just a couple of pages over, actually, on page 522, we have hang on. Oh, yes. What then is a memory which we do not recall? Or indeed, let us go further. We do not recall our memories of the last 30 years, but we were wholly steeped in them. Why then stop short at 30 years? Why not extend this previous life back to before our birth? If I do not know a whole section of the memories that are behind me, if they are invisible to me, if I do not have the faculty of recalling them to me, how do I know whether in that mass that is unknown to me there may not be some that extend back much further than my human existence? If I can have in me and around me So many memories I do not remember. This oblivion, a de facto oblivion at least, since I have not the faculty of seeing anything, may extend over a life which I have lived in the body of another man, even on another planet. A common oblivion obliterates everything. That just kind of struck me because it's rather speculative on the narrator's part, perhaps fancifully so. But it kind of reminded me of that Platonic notion, anamnesis, where it's like all knowledge is memory, right? That you existed perhaps in some capacity even before birth, and that the knowledge that you accrue in your life is actually kind of harkening back to what you already knew in your prior state. Again, probably pretty fanciful, but and I thought it had a little bit of merit to it, at least to be sufficiently worth reading. So finally, the last thing I'd like to read on page 571 is, oh yes, this is the narrator remarking on how people change over time and how time changes people once again, which is, again, a very prominent theme in the work that is In Search of Lost Time. So he says, people never cease to change place in relation to ourselves. In the imperceptible but eternal march of the world, we regard them as motionless, in a moment of vision too brief for us to perceive the motion that is sweeping them on. But we have only to select in our memory two pictures taken of them at different moments, close enough together, however, for them not to have altered in themselves, perceptibly, that is to say. And the difference between the two pictures is a measure of the distance, of the displacement that they have undergone in relation to us. Um, it's right, right. You know, memory is kind of like a film, right? We perceive the world as kind of a strung together uh, reel of static images and such. And if you take one of those out from like way back in the film and then compare it to one later on, you'll see myriad changes have taken place in the person who is the subject of your scrutiny. And yeah, I just like that. I thought it was true, and it evokes kind of one of the main themes of the work is just how time changes people and how things are altered by their continued existence. So yeah, good stuff. So yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah, Volume 4 of In Search of Lost Time, better than Volume 3, I think, but maybe not as good as the second volume, and probably not as good as the first volume, I would say. But I'm still hooked. I'm still gonna go for the gold and finish the series. Um, so yeah, I'm going to give it an A minus. Good book, just not the most thrilling thing I've ever read. Um, but yeah, have you read Sodom and Gomorrah? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today, or really have you just read In Search of Lost Time in its entirety? Let me know. And if you haven't read Sodom and Gomorrah, well, you'd have to read the other books to get to this point. So you will know if you're up to that task. But as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.